Hello, welcome to another episode of Voxel Heist, the series where we will be learning Unity and hopefully have a fully fledged game by the end. This episode, titled Player Controller, Interactions and Crouching Setup, will be looking at the following. We'll be expanding the player controller with context-aware interaction and the ability to essentially crouch, thus hiding our character in this heist game. But first we'll be looking at our task that was set last episode. So to show that off, here we can see we can move around the player, and if I press left shift on my keyboard, they speed up. So heading over to our script, you can see I did it so that if sprint.action is pressed, we set the move speed to a sprint speed, which is just set as a private float. And when sprint is no longer pressed, so else, we just set the move speed back to what it was originally. So with that gone over, we will be looking at first implementing the buttons that will allow us to interact and crouch. So heading over to the input system, you can see that we already have default keybinds. For example, E to interact and C to crouch. So if we open our player controller, we can add a couple of different fields that will allow us to set this up. So I will set up a private float and we'll call this interact range. This will dictate the distance our player can begin to interact with things. And whilst we're here, I'll also add the crouching. Crouch, 1. We'll get into this later into the episode, but we are setting a crouch height, a stand height, and the crouch speed, along with a private boolean called is crouching. Lord, we've already gotten to the point where you may discover this as you continue coding, but some words stop looking like words. And today that looks like the word crouch for me, as it's already begun to look incorrect. Though I can safely say I don't believe it's spelled incorrectly. I also have this with dialogue when I see it too many times. Okay, so to continue from our interaction bit of code, I'd first like to tidy up our script here. So we can do that with a built-in feature for regions. So I'm going to do #region and type in movement variables. I can then do at the bottom of the region, end region. And as you can see, it sort of binds everything in a kind of folder. Also move crouching to here. Have crouching variables, paste that back in, and end region. And I will actually set up another region for our interaction variables. I think it looks a bit neater this way. We could also just go for comments. But I feel the region does the same, but also allows us to collapse specific regions. So we are going to create a new void and call this try interact. Won't take in any variables, but we'll be looking at raycasting. So I'll say to envision this and we'll be able to actually see it later on. But from a position, we can fire a ray in any direction for any length. We can also check with that ray if it's hit anything. This is how we will be detecting interactions, as if it's hit something we can interact with, we can then execute code on that interactable object. We'll start this by creating a new ray. So we'll have transform dot position, and the direction will be transform forward. I may need to retune this to the camera, but we'll see. We then have an if statement for physics dot raycast, which is going to be one of two things. This function will be actually shooting the ray from our designated position in the direction that we've decided, but we're also able to get something back, a boolean, as to if it hit anything or not. So we will type in our ray, which is evidently the ray that we've just created. We can then have an out, which we'll define as a raycast hit and hit. So this is the hit info. If it has hit anything, it will populate hit with that object. And we'll just set it to our interact range for our max distance. And then do a debug.log. Just say we have hit.collider.name. So the array that we cast will be looking for an object that is hit with a collider. Now what we can do, we need to set up our input action reference. Public input action reference, and we'll have this as our interact, and we will say if interact.action was pressed this frame, we can try interact, and it simply put us if it was pressed on this frame. We're doing this instead of is pressed, as this can be continuous, whereas this will only happen once unless we're spamming the actual key. This is to help alleviate update from having to do this every frame. We're holding down our interact key. So if I head back over to Unity, head to our player and add in the interact input action, quickly save, and I'll actually add the ability for us to see the ray that we cast. We'll be doing this with debug.drawRay, and we'll pass in the same variables that we put for the ray's creation. We can also color this, I believe, so we'll do red. And we'll see if this works. So heading back to Unity, if I press play, you can still move around, but if I turn gizmos on, one thing that I should do is probably take this out of the actual check first, as this will only draw when we actually interact with something. If we now go around and press That's interesting. Okay, you can kind of see the flicker of red at our feet because that's the transform position of our player. So we actually need to set the transform from the camera perspective. Apologies, I keep saying camera perspective, but we're playing an isometric game, not a first-person game. So we can actually just do it from the center of the body, which I can do like this. Like vector 3, direction, offset. And we can just add that interaction to our transformed position. And we'll do the same with our draw ray. So heading back to Unity, we can set the interaction offset. I will do 0.5. And actually I'm going to change was pressed this frame to is pressed just for us to test this. So heading back over. Okay, so 0.5 is too short, so it'll be 1 and a bit, I'm thinking. Okay, there we are. So you can see this red line shows our interaction. And it's actually easier to see on our game view now because it's not happening for one frame. So currently we're just logging if it hits something, and I can show this by adding a cube. Scale it up a bit. And now, if we press play, you should be able to see that if I'm facing away, nothing pops up in the console, but our interaction has hit the cube. You can see how the red line is intersecting with the actual cube, and it is obviously detecting that it's hit it. So as I said, right now we're just logging that it's hitting something. We'll be working on a full interaction system using interfaces later in this series. But for now, we're just validating that the player will be interacting with something. Next, we'll just be implementing having the player crouching, which will be a rather simple void toggle crouch. Again, doesn't take in any variables, and we'll just do a nice little trick to toggle is crouching. So we have a boolean is crouching. Adding an exclamation mark to the front of it means it's the opposite of what this boolean is. So is crouching, let's say, is true. We're saying the opposite of that. So this is false. So then we're applying it to the variable itself, the actual boolean. Okay, let's implement this in an interesting way. I won't say a correct way, but later down the line, I plan to do an episode on animation, where we will make our own crouching animation for our player. But in the meanwhile, I think we can do something interesting. Okay, what we can do is we will create a float and have this as, I'll call this the player height. Now we are going to do a thing called, something called a ternary conditional operator. I will write it out first and then go into detail as to what it's doing. It's a kind of shorthand for an if-else statement, like we have here. However, we are questioning is crouching. And we're simply saying if it is true, then we'll be doing this. So the if part, we're always doing if this is true, we're doing this. Else, do this. So we can easily set player height to one of two values within just this one line of code. So, is the player crouching? If yes, we set them to the crouch height, or at least set this float to the crouch height. If is crouching is false, we then set them to the stand height. And we can simply do that by transform dot local scale dot y equals player height. It's not a variable. Apologies. We have to create a new vector 3 and create it based on the current scale. So local scale dot x local transform dot local scale dot z, and then have this set to local scale. As initially we were trying to edit a variable within the vector 3, we have to actually edit the vector 3 itself. So heading back up to our crouching variables, we'll need to add a public input action reference. This will be our crouch. And like we did with our interact, if crouch.action was pressed this frame, we'd like to toggle crouch. And again, we're doing was pressed this frame, so it's not spamming it every frame. And because we'll be changing the height of the actual character, or the scale, I'm going to change these instead of 1 and 2 to 0.5 and 1. 1 being the default scale. For us to utilize our crouch speed multiplier, we will add a new variable into our movement variables, this being a float. It will be current speed multiplier. And we'll just set this to 1. We can then go into our temp move in fixed update, where we're setting this up, and times this by current speed multiplier. Then if we go to toggle crouch, this is where we can do another ternary operator, and have is crouching. We'll query this and say it'll either be crouch speed multiplier or 1. So when we're crouching, our speed will be halved essentially. And let's see if this works. This will be rather interesting. Oh, spammed errors. That's because I forgot to set the crouch reference. There we go. Okay, and so you can see that we're crouching. We are slower. So we now have 3 speeds. However, I think if we shift, yes, that will still work. And that will be at the same height. But we now have the ability to crouch, which I find quite funny. And I'm tempted to still go through with the crouch animation, but just not implement it, because I love the look of him doing that. And I think with that, that will be our episode for today. Your task for this episode is, you can see that we can still sprint when we're moving. However, when we're crouched, we can no longer sprint. I'm pressing shift or spamming shift, I don't know if my mic picks that up, Our movement no longer changes when we're crouched, but does continue to work when we're stood up. And hopefully that should be pretty straightforward. All it is using a variable that we have access to and just adding it on to an if statement. But with that said and done, I think this will come out to be a relatively short episode. Thank you all so much for watching. Please feel free to like and subscribe. Check out the links in my description. And I'll see you next week. Bye.